We're making this envelope folder today, taking you through it step by step. We're creating the fold out here in the middle, and we've already made the pockets. This is part 2 in a series. Last week we made the cover. I'll leave a link to part 1 in the description box down below. We'll make the envelopes today and decorate them, and I'll give you dimensions and lots of tips as we go, so that you can use your own book pages and other lovely paper supplies. And don't forget to subscribe today. I have lots more fun projects to come, and hit the notification bell as well so you don't miss part 3. I'll be making this junk journal notebook next week and really just bringing it all together. So are you comfy at your craft desk? Let's make these envelopes. I'm beginning with the largest of the envelopes, and for this I'm using a page from a glossy book. I'll show you in just a minute. We're going to turn it into this beautiful envelope by using a piece of paper from a Collection by Tracy Fox, and I'm using just one sheet to get the most out of it. I'm going to cover both the front and back of the envelope, and this is the sheet that I'm using today, but of course you can use anything in your supplies. I just love the vintage feel of that one. I'm also going to make a couple of mid-size envelopes like this, and I'll be showing you how these fit into the little mechanism and give us a bit of fun by decorating the front as well. So we're turning rather ugly glossy book pages into something a lot prettier without having to spend money on some perhaps more expensive cardstock today. You can see that I've made quite a few examples here. I got carried away. I just really enjoy decorating the front of those envelopes. The smallest of the envelopes today is made from a page from a Shakespearean book, so I'll show you how to make that too. The supplies that I'm using today are a scoreboard, a bone folder and scissors, but you don't have to have the scoreboard to make these envelopes. I'll give you dimensions so that you can do it without. I have some glue and cardstock from last week that we're going to use to make the cover for the junk journal notebook. And these are just a few new pencils I'm going to have a little play with when we decorate one of those envelopes, just a bit of fun. The envelopes are really easy to make, and you can make this project your own if you draw on your other supplies and maybe add a bit of colour. Add something that's really you to the front of those envelopes. I'm going to cut a piece from the vintage paper that's big enough to cover the journal notebook, and then use what's left over to decorate the large envelope. And doing this in this order means that I make the very most of a single piece of paper. I'm being quite frugal. So just before we make the envelopes, we're going to take that vintage paper, decide which part of it we want to use on the journal cover and which on the envelope, and stick it to the front of that cardstock. The cardstock here is a piece that we created last week. It's the offcut from the extension to the envelope fold out in its entirety. So it's an extra piece that we held on to so that we could make this little junk journal notebook. So it's quite efficient use of the papers, and I just really like that. I like being quite economical and using up all of my scraps and all of my lovely book pages. So all I'm doing is sticking that piece of compendium scrapbook paper, that digi, onto the front of my journal cover, leaving this piece here to put on the side, and we'll use that in a second to decorate the largest of the envelopes. I love using book pages in all of my journaling, my junk journaling, whether it's tearing it up to make collage or making envelopes or sticking on tags. I have a video setting out lots of ideas for how you can use book pages in your journaling and junk journaling, so check that out. I'll leave a link in the description box down below. And with the notebook cover done, I can set that aside. We'll be filling it next week with lots of lovely papers. I'm moving on to making the first of the envelopes, the largest one, that sits at the front of the flip-flap mechanism here, and that will get covered with that remaining sheet of scrapbook paper, digipaper. For the envelope, I'm using a large book page, and it's a glossy page from this book of flowers. I find that these glossy sheets are more common in books in charity shops in the UK, so perhaps a little bit easier to find. Ordinarily, when I make envelopes from these these book pages, I'll think about what I want to be on the outside of the envelope and what can sit on the inside, so which pictures are less pretty. But of course, as we're making the envelopes today, it doesn't matter because we're going to decorate them. I'm using the first groove in the scoreboard to score the sides, and the groove is at about 2 centimetres. I'll leave in the description box down below the details about where all of the grooves are. I'm using this to create a fairly deep envelope and wide, so this will be big enough to act as the main envelope in the envelope flip-flap mechanism. I'm using groove number 3 here to score the top flap, and the bottom flap will be folded at 4 just there. And what I'm doing is creating grooves so that when I fold up the top and the bottom of the envelope, the overlap will be about 1.5 centimetres. So you don't really need the scoreboard to achieve that, it just makes life a little bit easier. The book page that I used here is about 29 centimetres tall by 23 centimetres wide, so a relatively large piece of paper to begin with, and I'm making sure that the folds are all nice and crisp and neat, because I think that just adds a little bit of extra detail when we bring it all together. It also makes life just a little bit easier when we come to decorate it. I don't need to think about which picture we're using on the outside here, although I would have liked to use that pretty one. It's a lovely winter scene. I'm just going to start making the cuts here down at the bottom to create the flaps. So I'm trimming just to the left of that fold and just above. A snip with my scissors. Let's do the left hand side. Cut just to the right of the fold and just above the horizontal line that we created, and that creates our bottom flap. And at the top I like to cut in just a little bit more, make it more envelope like. So you can see I'm using my scissors about 1 centimetre, they begin from the left of that fold, and snip out there, not using a ruler, just doing it by eye. So taking out a little portion, and this gives us our template that's so easy to glue down. I need a strip of glue either side here, just here and here, so I'm using my tacky glue, and I'm leaving a bit of a gap where I start the glue, so there's none here or here, and that means that the glue doesn't sort of seep out onto the front of the envelope and stick it all together. And it really is as easy as that. We have an envelope here that will be perfect for decorating with this lovely French style digipaper. Isn't that beautiful? I just love it. So we're going to stick the pretty paper on the front and then the back of the envelope. And my top tip at this point, speaking from experience, is just have a think about making sure how you get it the right way up. It'd be really easy at this point to stick this piece of paper onto the front of the envelope upside down. I'm choosing to keep this little bit of extra type, a lovely little font, on the front of the envelope, so the piece of paper I have is just a little bit too big, and I'm making sure that I attach it to the envelope so that I cut off the portion that is least wanted. So by hand with scissors, I guess you could use a trimmer, I'm just going to take off the excess piece, and this will be used in its entirety on the back of the envelope, so keeping the theme all together and using as much of every piece of paper that we possibly can. So even this little snippet here, this little extra, I keep on the side and I'll use in another project, maybe to make a cluster or to do some collage. So this piece I use to really take away some of that glossy book page. Pretty though it is in the right context and in the right places, I don't really want that glossiness to show through as much as it would. So I'm adding the remaining piece from my single sheet. So we use some on the front of the notebook, some on the front of the envelope, and the last piece here. I'm doing a little bit of sticking and collage on the back of the envelope, again retaining that extra piece. I did some collaging on the front of a junk journal recently in a collaboration with Artie May's Andrea Allen. So using pieces of paper like this, you can either have fun decorating an envelope, or maybe the front of a junk journal cover? Is that something you like to do? If you want to see my video, then there's a link in the description box down below. I pulled out papers in more vintage shades today, certainly not as vibrant as I sometimes use. And I'm taking a piece that will go on the left here, maybe with a torn edge. I quite like that. Just a muted green, a gentle green that goes with the tones in the rest of the envelope folder and the sense of vintage. I'm just about to stick that on when I realise maybe the edge that isn't as frayed is the one that I'd prefer to have on the back here. I don't always have a plan in every detail when I do my videos. I like to go a little bit ad hoc. You've got to let your creative juices flow, I think, and do whatever you feel like as you move forwards. And I'm just testing my sanity here. Have I actually got it the right way up? Yes, I think I have. So we can move on to making the mid-size envelope, which I make from a really lovely book, again from a charity shop. 50 Bedtime Stories. Sometimes you ask which book I've used for making some of my envelopes and tags and pockets, so I thought I'd show you one in this case. It's a children's book, and so it has some lovely pictures, and the pages with pictures I do tend to use in my junk journals. So for making the junk journal pages, look at that one, isn't it fun? I've taken a few pages out and I just sit and score a few of them, which makes it easy to create several envelopes in a batch. So I'm scoring again using that first groove, and again counting, in this case, groove number 3 and groove number 2, because we're starting with a smaller piece of paper. But again, the theory is that when all of these sides are neatly and crisply folded, the top and the bottom flaps will overlap by about 1.5 centimetres. So you can work out where you want your folds to be. Taking a little bit of time just to get them in the right place and make those folds neat. This is quite a thick book page, and I think that's quite useful for the envelope flip-flap mechanism as a whole. So a tip would be maybe choose thicker pieces of paper, even if they're glossy, rather than those thinner, delicate vintage book pages, pretty though they are, because I think we can have fun decorating them, and I quite like the robustness and firmness of that flip-flap mechanism when it's finished. You can of course use your vintage papers, and maybe you don't even need to decorate the envelope then. Whatever suits you and whatever your supplies are, just play with them and make the most of them. The book page that I've used here is about 22 centimetres by 17 centimetres, and as you can see, I've used the same method for just snipping out the corners. We need 2 of these, so I'm very quickly going to run up another, and then we're going to have a lot of fun collaging on the front, stamping, decorating, again using whatever you have to make this project your own, and maybe use up some of those unloved supplies that don't get as much attention. So here we have the 2 mid-sized envelopes done, ready to decorate on the front. I'm delving into my little box of neutral papers here. I have this under my desk, and whenever an offcut comes or I have a page that looks useful, it goes into the box, and I find this a really useful technique for having a go-to place for neutral and beige papers with lots of different textures and fonts and designs on them. Organisation of scrapbook papers and book pages is an ongoing challenge in my craft room, and I'd love to know if you face that challenge too. Is it an uphill struggle to keep a grip of all of the papers that you have, or do you have some magical technique for staying on top of it all and staying organised? Do let me know in a comment down below. I've taken a vintage book page here and I'm using a single page to cover the front, again making sure that the envelope that I'm sticking down is the right way up. So covering the front with glue, I'm being quite careful about where I place that book page so that I get the font on the front, the type, which I really like, in the position that I want. So I'm leaving a bit of a raggedy edge on the right here, and indeed I'm not even going to cut that off when I trim things down. I'm placing one of the two envelopes that we made at the top of the page and one a little bit lower. And again, I'm thinking about placement so that I make the most of the text that's on the page behind on that vintage book page. I'm just checking that I have it the right way up. They both go the same way. So again, the text on the front on that book page will be upright when we turn it over. And not only does this give it a really nice effect on the front of the envelope, it means we can be a bit more creative in making envelopes without having to have a vintage book page that's big enough in the first instance. Here's one I made earlier. I've always wanted to say that. I'm trimming it down, just taking my scissors and trimming off at the bottom and on the side here. So a narrow piece to trim there, but the raggedy edge, yep, I think it adds something, so that's going to stay. And the second one here leaves a small piece of book page, which again will go back into my neutrals box. I'll use that in some form of collage, no doubt. So now we have two medium-size envelopes, and it's time to maybe bring in a little bit of colour. I had created a small piece of paper to add to the front, and when I looked at it, I decided it was just a little bit too colourful, a little bit too dark, particularly as we're going to do a little bit of stamping and painting on top. So I found a more neutral piece, and I'm just trimming it down so that it is big enough to add a feature to the front of the envelope, making the corners rounded. I quite like that, but it doesn't completely cover up all of that type in the vintage book page behind. So we're getting some contrast, we've got some spots, the shade, the tone of that little piece of paper is relatively neutral, so it goes with the theme of the vintage pattern in the papers that we used before, and it's going to act as a great base for doing a little bit of stamping. And I haven't done this for quite some time on my channel. I've really missed it. It's a great way of adding detail, like we did when we made these collage cards a few weeks ago. I have a video if you're interested, check that out in the description box down below. It's a really easy way of adding something extra and different to each of our projects, and gives us an opportunity to crack open a paint palette and maybe put some colour onto an envelope, or use our pencils or any other medium that you want to play with. So I'm setting that aside to dry, and just pulling on a few more bits of those little pieces of scrapbook paper in vintage colours, and using the other strip that I tore to just make a little bit of an upright banner here, an upright collage on the left hand side of the other envelope. Picking a piece of spotty paper, I think this is K&Co paper from a stack that I have, and with a torn piece there I will add that as a second layer onto the front of that envelope. Again, layering I think adds some detail, choosing colours that go together, choosing some contrast in the design, snipping a little bit off the bottom, and we're ready to add a focal point again, drawing on what's in my box of neutrals. I have some wrapping paper there from IKEA which I like to use in my collage, having a little rummage through, and this has caught my eye. The yellow tone of the page here is really pretty, and I like the font at the top. So I'm tearing off a piece, and I'm going to add that as a feature on the front here, shaping the corners on one of the ends. I will layer that over the top, and why stick it down with a straight edge when it can be wiggly? One of the ways I go about crafting is to try to think, what would I normally do, and can I do something different? And it helps to prompt me into using some of my supplies and have different designs, so that I don't just sit in the same track and do the same thing every time. So here we have two decorated fronts, and I'm moving on to using a little paint palette that I really haven't used for a very long time. I did use this a year ago when I did one of my first Journal with Me videos, sharing some tips and ideas for collaging and painting a cactus. So I'm getting out my water and a little brush, and I'm mixing up again a vintage colour. So the colour that I'm using today is something that reminds me of the kind of materials, the plush velvets that you might see in an old historic house here in Britain. So if you go and visit properties in the National Trust, if you wander around some of those beautiful old buildings, you sometimes see materials in deep green, an old vintage colour, and I'm trying to emulate that in the shade that I've mixed with this palette, maybe adding a slightly darker colour to the collar here of this waistcoat, just so that that is visible and distinct from the rest of the body. But whatever the stamp you have fun with your paints and your pencils, and maybe just add a cheeky bit of colour to your envelope folder today. I'm adding a little bit of faux stitching around the mat here, relatively small stitches, quite dainty to suit the scale of the envelope. And I think I'll add a little bit more feature to the bottom left of the envelope here in the form of some checkerboard washi, so a black and brown that goes with the hues in the rest of that cover. I'm adding a small stamp to the bottom right here. It's a cute little bicycle, and that will add a bit of extra feature using the space, the real estate at the bottom right of that envelope front. But it's still a dainty feature, so I think it's proportionate to the rest of that page, nothing too dominant. I'll add another bit of faux stitching in a different style, so this is a dash and a dot, and that seems to have a bit of a whimsical feel that matches the bicycle, and the flowers in the basket at the front of the bike just get a little bit of colour. I'm using some new watercolour pencils here that I've just started to play with, so adding a bit of colour to bring out the pigment. And now we have two medium-size envelopes decorated and ready to use. I'm pulling a page out of a third book, a William Shakespeare book of plays, relatively small page, and this is also going to be used to make the smallest of the envelopes in our envelope flip out. It's thinner paper, so I'm being quite careful when I create those ridges. Again, scoring in grooves so that the overlap will be just about 1.5 centimetres. Third groove, that is, for this one, at the bottom, and at the top. To make a smaller flap, we'll just use the second groove. So really easy to do using the same method. And I'll do the folding to make the edges crisp, and then we'll cut that and stick it down to make the smallest envelope. Do let me know if you have a go at making this envelope folder, or indeed any of the other envelope folders or pocket folders that I have on my channel. I'd love to know if you create any sort of variety or have any paper preferences when you put yours together. Do you have any tips to share that we can all benefit from? Please do leave a comment down below. I read them all and I do my very best to answer as many of you as possible. So feel free to leave a comment, and I hope you have fun making this folder. It's one of the most fun projects I've done so far, so I hope you have a go. I'm snipping out the corner pieces just as we did with the other two envelopes, adding a bit of glue to the bottom, remembering to leave that gap so the back flap doesn't stick to the front. And this means we now have all we need to put the flip-flap mechanism together, with a pretty front envelope decorated with vintage papers, two personally decorated mid-size envelopes, and a small one here. We can also add a little decoration in the middle, and again you can make this personal and add as much or as little as you want, using the cover now that we created in last week's video. I'm going to attach this envelope here, this medium-size one, into the flap of the largest envelope, making it fit snugly along the ridge so that the fold is neatly nestled within the fold of the larger envelope. So the glue goes on just the flap of this smaller one, and we need to tuck it neatly into the fold of the larger one, and I'm intentionally putting it slightly higher. It's not in the middle of that flap of the larger envelope. And this gives us the front flap mechanism, and we're really just going to repeat that with the other two envelopes. So making sure that I have things the right way up, I'm going to just snugly glue this little Shakespearean envelope, adding glue to the flap and making sure that that fits neatly into the envelope flap of the larger decorated envelope. So now we have two parts ready made to our flip flap mechanism, and we can put those into the middle portion of the cover. So far so good. So let's start by adding to the back cover here this beautiful double flip, and I'm positioning this first envelope so that there's space to the left of it where the cover folds. So just here you can see there's still a bit of space to the left of these envelopes. So adding the glue just to the flap, it's time to stick that down. I shared some similar tips and ideas and hopefully some inspiration when I made a pocket folder recently from a book about birds. We made a cover in a similar way, added some different pockets and stuffed them full of lovely ephemera. So if you like making envelope and pocket folders, check out that video. I'll leave a link in the description box down below. And now we've got the first fold out of our envelope flip flap mechanism, and we can add the second just to the bottom right here. So again, adding glue to the back of the flap, we will position that, and I think on this occasion I'm going to try putting it so that it's just visible when the top flap folds. In the sample that I'd already created, I had it nestling right behind so it wasn't visible, but I felt like a little bit of a change here, so as those flaps fold, you just see a little bit peeping out, just like that. It's quite satisfying when it all comes together, and we're really moving on now, so it's time to add maybe a little image in the centre here, something that you could draw or paint yourself, something that just covers up a little bit of the top flaps, which I felt made it visually a little bit more appealing, a little bit prettier. What do you think? So I've stamped and coloured that with pencils, and I'm also decorating the back of one of those mid-size envelopes. This is an image again from the Compendium collection from Tracy Fox. All I've done is just cut out an image from one of the pages, and that was just on copy paper, gluing it down to the back of that envelope flap and adding a little bit of a border in faux stitching, and it all goes together with the vintage theme and the colours and the tones, so it's starting to build up into something that's hopefully quite cohesive. I'm adding more detail to one of the envelopes, to the back of that lower right one, just with a piece of washi, and it's botanical, so it's not necessarily vintage, but I felt that the colours went and I wanted some extra details to add to the back of those envelope flaps. Equally, I'm choosing to use a couple of my washes, again in darker shades, so black, brown, and finishing off that image in the middle of the cover with a border, and the faux stitching this time is in a gentle shade of grey pen. And here we have the envelope folder mechanism created, ready for us to add the pockets that we made last week and the journal notebook that we're going to make next week. So hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and come back next week when we'll finish it off, adding all of these extra bits of decoration so that we have the most beautiful envelope folder finished and done. I hope to see you soon.